Welcome back to the deep dive. Sometimes you look at a map, see two countries side by side, and assume a straightforward history. But often, it's much more tangled. Today, we're getting into one of those really complex histories. We're looking at a detailed analysis of sovereignty claims between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The core question we're exploring, based on this analysis, is why Ethiopia couldn't legitimately claim continuous rule over the land that became Eritrea.
Exactly. And this isn't just about drawing lines on a map. It forces us, and hopefully you too, to think hard about what rule even means. We're not just talking shared culture or proximity. We need to dissect the administrative history. It's about taxes, laws, bureaucracy. That's, the nitty-gritty of sovereignty. We'll trace how these shared ancient roots kind of branched off onto very different political paths.
Right. The difference between, say, cultural affinity and actual political control seems key here.
Okay.
So first things first. Before we jump into Aksum or anything, the analysis starts by setting a standard. What definition of rule are we working with?
Yeah, and it's a deliberately high bar. The analysis insists on continuous, effective, sovereign administration. That means consistent, demonstrable evidence. We're talking about things like a functioning tax system, laws being enforced, a stable bureaucracy, all run by that single sovereign power without significant interruption.
Okay, continuous and effective. That sounds really strict. I mean, applying that globally, wouldn't many historical claims sort of crumble?
That's precisely the point the analysis makes. It demands documented proof, not just assumptions based on proximity or shared heritage. And there's a really important caveat. Sporadic military campaigns, some temporary religious influence, even sharing language or culture, none of that counts as continuous sovereignty.
So, just because people in Southern California speak Spanish doesn't mean Mexico City gets to collect taxes there.
Exactly. It's about who is actually consistently governing the place. That's the lens we need to use as we look back through the timeline.
Okay, sharpens the focus considerably. Let's apply that strict lens then. Starting way back, the Axumite Kingdom, 1st to 7th centuries CE, big kingdom, powerful, covered parts of modern Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. Seems like a slam dunk for shared origin. Maybe even Ethiopian control.
Well, yes and no. The analysis frames Aksum as a shared civilizational origin, absolutely. But it pushes back hard against the idea that this translates directly into continuous Ethiopian political control over the entire area ever since. A shared starting point doesn't automatically mean one part owned the other indefinitely. And even during Aksum's peak, the reality on the ground was more complex. The sources point specifically to the coastal regions, especially the port of Adulis. Adulis wasn't just some outpost. It was a major hub, deeply connected through trade networks across the Red Sea to Arabia, the Mediterranean. It had its own economic focus.
Wait, so even back then, during Aksum, this key coastal area, Adulis, it kind of looked outwards. Its administration was tied to maritime trade, maybe distinct from the highland capital.
That's the argument. Its economic lifeblood, its day-to-day administrative concerns, they were oriented towards the sea, towards international trade. This suggests a degree of specialized governance, maybe even autonomy, that complicates the picture of simple, unified control from the Axumite center.
Okay, that puts a crack in the continuous rule idea right at the start. So, what happens after Aksum declines? We move into the medieval and early modern periods, say 13th to 19th centuries.
Right, and this long stretch is critical because what you see, according to the analysis, is the rise and consolidation of distinct local polities within what's now Eritrea, particularly in the highlands and coastal areas. We're talking centuries of largely independent local rule. The most prominent example they focus on is Medri Bahri, the land of the sea. This wasn't just a place name, it was a political entity. It was governed by rulers called the Bar Negus, who were, for long periods, effectively semi-independent.
Semi-independent meaning they weren't just local chiefs paying occasional tribute. They were actually running the show locally, like taxes, laws, that sort of thing.
Pretty much. The argument is that the Bar Negus often functioned as the primary sovereign power for the people living there. If the Ethiopian emperor couldn't consistently collect taxes or enforce laws in Medri Bahri,
then the continuous effective administration test fails for that period.
Exactly. The central highland authority was often distant, sometimes weak, and the Bar Negus filled that power vacuum running their own administration.
And wasn't there also the issue of other powers getting involved, especially on the coast?
Absolutely. That's another major point in the analysis. Over centuries, various parts of the Eritrean coast fell under the influence or even direct control of external powers. Think Ottomans, then Egyptians. They established garrisons, collected customs duties, intervened in local politics. You can't claim continuous Ethiopian rule when other recognized powers are actively administering parts of the territory.
Okay, so the medieval and early modern periods show significant breaks in central control, both internal with Medri Bahri and external with Ottoman and Egyptian presence. That takes us towards the modern era. What does the analysis identify as the decisive break? The point where any theoretical continuity is just severed.
That would be the arrival of Italy. The establishment of the Italian colony of Eritrea formalized in 1890 after the Treaty of Wuchau. This is presented as the definitive institutional separation.
Not just a border change, but...
No, much more fundamental. Italy created an entirely new, separate colonial state. They imposed their own laws, their own courts, built different infrastructure, introduced new economic systems, a separate administration from top to bottom. The analysis argues this completely overwrote any residual or theoretical Ethiopian claim. It created a distinct political and administrative reality on the ground.
A reality that lasted for decades, embedding a completely different system of governance.
Exactly. And that separation didn't end with Italy's defeat in World War II. From 1941 until 1952, Eritrea was under British military administration. The British basically kept the existing colonial borders and administrative structures intact. This further solidified Eritrea's status as a distinct territory, separate from Ethiopia under international supervision. There was no return to Ethiopian rule during that period either.
Okay, so that leads into a really interesting kind of complex legal phase after the war. The UN gets involved. They decide to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia in 1952 Resolution 390V. Why is the nature of this federation so important? It wasn't just handing Eritrea over, right?
No, absolutely not. And this is crucial legally. The UN explicitly rejected annexation.
Yeah.
Resolution 390V established a federation, and crucially, it granted Eritrea autonomous status within that federation. This meant Eritrea kept its own government, its own legislative assembly, its own courts, even its own flag and seal. It could levy its own taxes for local matters. Ethiopia handled federal things like defense and foreign affairs.
So it was a partnership, legally defined and supervised by the UN, recognizing Eritrea's distinct character.
Precisely. It acknowledged the separate path Eritrea had been on, especially during the colonial and British periods. It was a legal arrangement, not a simple absorption. It was designed to protect Eritrea's autonomy.
Which makes Ethiopia's action in 1962, unilaterally dissolving the federation and annexing Eritrea as its 14th province, makes it a pretty clear violation of that UN agreement.
According to this analysis, yes. It was a direct breach of the internationally sanctioned framework established by Resolution 390V. And because that act of annexation was unilateral and violated the UN mandate, the subsequent 30 years of Ethiopian control are argued to lack legitimacy.
It failed the legitimate sovereignty test because the foundation was flawed.
Exactly. It wasn't based on consent or the agreed-upon legal framework. And of course, that illegal annexation is what triggered the 30-year armed struggle for independence. The final word really came with the UN-monitored referendum in 1993. You had Eritreans voting, and the result was 99.8% in favor of independence.
Wow, 99.8%.
Yeah, an overwhelming confirmation. The analysis presents this as definitive proof that the preceding Ethiopian control was seen as imposed, contested, and ultimately illegitimate by the population itself.
Okay, so we follow this thread. Strict definition of rule, complexity in Aksum, distinct local rule in Medri Bahri, external influences, the definitive colonial break, the UN Federation, its violation, and finally independence confirmed by referendum. What's the legacy of all this divergence today? How did this separate path shape modern Eritrea beyond just politics?
Well, the argument is that decades of separate administration, first Italian, then British, followed by the specific terms of the UN Federation, even though violated, and finally the 30-year struggle forged a distinct national identity. The source points to things like the separate institutions, obviously, but also the different infrastructure, railways, roads, ports built under Italy, and even a distinct social fabric, including a prominent multi-faith national identity that solidified during the resistance. These things created cultural and administrative differences from Ethiopia.
So, the shared ancient roots, while historically true, become less relevant compared to the concrete administrative and political path taken over the last century or so.
That's the core conclusion. The analysis essentially says, look, shared heritage back in Aksum is interesting history, but it doesn't translate into a modern political claim when stacked against nearly a century of separate administration, international legal status, and a popular war for independence.
So boiling it all down one last time, the central argument rests on the lack of continuous, effective, legitimate administration by Ethiopia over the territory we now call Eritrea.
Precisely. The standard of proof required by the analysis that documented on-the-ground, uninterrupted sovereign function just isn't met through large stretches of history and is decisively broken by the colonial period and subsequent events. Institutional history trumps ancient ties in this view.
We've covered a lot of ground from defining sovereignty very strictly, looking at ancient Aksum, the rise of Medri Bahri, the impact of colonialism, the UN's role, and finally, the independence referendum. It really underscores how crucial that administrative continuity is.
Absolutely. And, thinking of the stringent definition they use, it does make you wonder. Well, if you took the same exacting standard, continuous, effective, documented administration with proof of taxation, laws, bureaucracy, and applied it rigorously to other contested territories or historical claims around the world, how many long-held assumptions about who owned what when might start to look a bit shaky?
That's a really provocative thought. Applying that legalistic lens universally could certainly challenge quite a few established narratives. Something definitely for you, our listeners, to think about.